have as many people as we need. I have a number of I've got some faces on my screen, and then I've got a lot of circles. Jane, can you go through the list?
I'm trying to count through. You have a quorum of individuals. I can't tell. It looks like Ed. There's a few people who aren't here yet, but.
Okay then, welcome everybody. And I guess by way of just setting the stage for this meeting, we have a number of procedural sort of process points to work through, including how we're going to deal with the appointment of consultants and how we should get consultants engaged to do the work that this committee needs done, and a few other process points. But in conversations with Peter and Jane, I've made the point that I think it's really important for us to engage on substance as soon as we can and start sharing our ideas. And we've agreed that, well, we will suggest to the committee, I'll put it that way, it's a suggestion and a committee decision, that for the next couple of committee meetings, we would devote the large majority of the time to vetting, discussing, presenting the leading high priority policy items that the discussion groups are developing. So I think it's time for the the task leaders to start presenting, fleshing out more the ideas that we've touched on previously, and putting them in front of the whole committee. So, you know, imagine among our 4 big discussion items, devoting an hour next time to the leading ideas for 2 of our issue areas, and an hour for, we can decide what order we want to go in, but let's just say an hour for transportation, an hour for buildings, and then the following meeting we do an hour for power and an hour for non-energy emissions, something like that. People may have opinions about changing the order, but the idea is let's get going and put some flesh on the ideas that have been floated, and let the full committee give some feedback on them. So I say that at the beginning of this meeting, just so you have in mind at least what I'm thinking about what we should be doing in the next couple of minutes.
This was in part a response to sort of everybody feeling like they might like to be involved in multiple task areas, and this gives us a little bit of opportunity to provide some in-process feedback to the groups as they're developing ideas. So
that's great, and it may also help us to guide the work of any consultants that are coming on board. If we know that the committee has come to an informal prioritization of some of the key areas, then at least we can ask our consultants early on to focus on those things. So it helps us also with the guidance that's needed for our supporting work. Let's take a look at today's agenda. Are there any topics that we should add or subtract? Anything else that we should be talking about? Joey?
Well, first, just thank you for that overview, and I think that makes a lot of sense to me, your thoughts and the strategy there. My question related to the agenda today, and it is not intended to put either Lauren or Kelly on the spot today, but maybe for future agendas, just as the liaisons to those subcommittees, just wanting at some point on if it works today, or certainly in future agendas, is a placeholder for what's happening in those other subcommittees so that reverberation is actually taking place.
So Lauren and Kelly, you can think about that, but we would like to hear from you when we can. All right, I see nods.
And I would add Jared to that as well as the data and science liaison.
I was wondering how Jared was getting out of that.
Well, we generally, I'm sorry, yes, please. You generally organically do that anyway, but I think being very precise about that makes a lot of sense. You're not off the hook.
I'm sure Jared doesn't want to say anything. Okay, thank you. There is a question which, you know, we can just touch on today, I assume, but we may want to discuss more fully as we're discussing our substantive ideas in the next couple of meetings. But there are some significant things going on outside of the Climate Council that are going to affect us. And that includes the administration of the funding that's coming to Vermont under the Recovery Act, the latest version of the Recovery Act, and also the potential use of funds that might be coming to Vermont in the federal infrastructure bill. And, you know, certainly on the latter, it's early days. On the former, I mean, the governor has announced an initiative to consider how the federal funding could be used to advance state goals, including climate goals. So it may be appropriate for the Climate Council and this committee to have that in mind as we discuss our highest priority topics. And so I realize that it's not exactly our charge, but on the other hand, it is our charge to come up with policies that can be implemented, and we might be able to make suggestions about that. Just want to flag that for something that might be relevant when we discuss our policy approaches. And I'll be happy to hear, Peter, if you have any comments on that. It's not something we've discussed.
Sorry, trying to get my mouse to the right screen for the muting. No, I don't have any additional thoughts on that round, Richard. Thanks.
Okay. All right. First order of business then is approval of the 3/18/21 minutes. Are there any comments, objections, corrections? We've done this by consensus in the absence of corrections. Everybody okay with that? Joey, I see your hand is still up, so okay. All right, I'll try to put the chat up. Okay, thanks. Well, then let's consider that the 3/18 minutes are approved. Are we ready with Megan O'Toole?
Megan, I saw you on. Are you ready?
Yes,
Right,
I am here.
welcome. All right.
At mute, Megan, I can introduce you and the topic if you'd like. I've done that for Matt, but just
sure.
Thank you so much to Megan for stepping in today and pinch hitting. And Megan has tons of expertise in this area, so it's been great to have her engagement at multiple subcommittees right now. So Megan is an attorney with DEC, Air and Quality Program, and Megan's here because, as all of you know, there was an email that was sent out to advise and require that subcommittee members who were not on board early on in the process to receive and hear the presentation related to open meeting laws and Freedom of Information Act requests. early on at the council meeting could then would be required to watch those presentations, read the associated materials, and then provide an opportunity today for any questions that have arose through the presentation of those materials, as well as counselors and others who are now getting more deep into the work and have questions that have come up associated with how to proceed with recognition of the guidance of those laws. So Megan's here, can step in and provide any better overview than I just did, as well as just support and answer any questions that you all have.
Thanks, Jane. That was great. Yeah, I don't really have anything to add, but I'm certainly happy to try to answer any questions that folks have related to, you know, how this group works together in compliance with the open meeting law, and then also how we can be transparent from the Public Records Act perspective as well.
Well, let me ask, we went through a pretty thorough training as a full council early on, and since then we've added new members to this committee. So I do want to make sure that the new members in particular are acquainted with the transparency rules and the open meeting rules. So I need to pause and make sure that that's happened, or make sure people are comfortable with what the rules are. So Dave says he's good to go.
And I'll also just acknowledge that, you know, sometimes situations can come up that might not fit squarely within some of the examples that were provided during the training, you know, and I'm happy to try to answer those specific questions if subcommittee members are concerned about how to proceed, you know, with communication that might be taking place outside of a meeting or any other situation, or a, you know, Public Records Act question. Please feel free to reach out to me via email or over the phone. I'm happy to try to work through specific scenarios if that's helpful.
Okay, Gina says she's set. I will remind people, you know, that it's to use the partner.vermont platform for emails. That's pretty easy. And I'm sure there will be a huge body of emails that end up, you know, in that document library. And other than that, the meetings of this committee are obviously open and public and recorded, and we will continue that process. Any questions? All right. Thanks, Megan, for, you know, being available, and I encourage people to get in touch directly with her if you have questions.
No problem. Thanks.
And Jane or I can facilitate that contact if it's helpful. So
I'll put my email in the chat if that would be helpful too.
Great,
thank you.
thanks. I would encourage people to ask questions. It's complicated and hard, and we want to make sure we get it right. And so ask the question. That way we can all make sure that we're doing everything we can to be as transparent as possible.
Okay. Thanks very much. Technical services RFP, Jane. You have been doing a lot of work.
Yes.
So,
amazingly, the technical services contract is not as complicated yet as the engagement and outreach one is. But I imagine it's headed down that path. So thank you for the space to talk about this today. I just want to echo and thank all the input and comments and help and guidance that I've received from people much smarter in this area to date in helping craft the RFP to this point. I've shared it all with you, and my apologies for getting it all out to you so late last night. But what I'd like to do today in the limited time that we have is share it on my screen and talk through particularly interesting points related to your work, the work of the subcommittee. And to date, this has been reviewed, and I have now last night incorporated all the edits of the Science and Data Subcommittee. So I think we're in a pretty good place with the technical services, except for a few high-level points that I'll share with you all today. Megan O'Toole also is the attorney providing support for me with respect to this RFP also. So it's great that she's with us today to hear your comments and questions. And she'll be going through it with sort of a finer lens and some internal questions that we have about how to route this. I do want to caution, I'm not sure, I can't remember, Peter and Richard, how we framed my illustration of sharing with you all, it's later on the agenda, the timeline associated with how this modeling will actually happen. But I'm already starting to feel like the timeline I'm going to share with you all today that TJ Poor and I have put together on a slide is perhaps overly optimistic. I'm already getting a little bit of pushback on how long it's going to actually take to get these services on contract. But I'm hopeful that we'll get the RFP out within the next week. And I've set what feels now perhaps more ambitious than it should be of a May 1st timeline to get these folks on contract, but now understanding the level of review that this contract is going to trigger because of the amount of it is likely to be, will likely need all sorts of review outside of the Agency of Natural Resources, including Agency of Digital Services, as well as the Secretary of State. So with that brief introduction, I just want to remind you all that this was built, the RFP was built off of thoughtful and amazingly helpful guidance that Jared took the lead on providing with input from TJ and I around the review and consolidation of the proposals that we got back from the RFI that we put out. And then recognizing that we all agreed that we would build the RFP for technical analyses off of the understanding that we would be informed and using the model being developed for the comprehensive energy plan. So there's a recognition that that model is underway, the LEAP model. This, we don't need to reinvent that, but rather get the additional services on board to further inform that work for the climate action plan. So let me share. And I can pause there if folks have any questions at that point.
So can I just make sure everybody understands that relationship?
Sure. Please do.
Between the LEAP model and what we're going to be analyzing. I think it's an important foundation point. Would you like questions about that? Yeah.
Yeah, good.
I mean, just some context setting
yeah,
would be helpful. Do you want to do that, Jane, or is there someone else on the call who should do that?
I'm happy to do it. I'm also happy to lean in to others who know it better than me, but you'll recall and understand that at the last council meeting, which I should also respect that maybe not all subcommittee members were present for, but the Public Service Department presented their timeline and requirements associated with the comprehensive energy plan that is currently underway, the revision 2. And associated with that is the development of a model to essentially analyze technology pathways in the version of a LEAP model. That model is being thought about and contracted through coordination with DEC, and Peter and Jared and others can speak much more detailed about what that will do, but it's essentially the premise and understanding for building the scenarios that we would then take further with respect to considerations for the economic modeling that would need to occur built off of the LEAP model. So that's sort of point one. We can't actually do the economic modeling until the LEAP model is done, which won't be till August. So we'll talk about that when we get to the timeline. We can start to do some of the modeling with respect to the business as usual scenario, which will be done in May, hopefully. But there's going to be some things that we can do with respect to the technical analyses that we're going to have on contract that can start as soon as those contracts are in place, whether that's the carbon budget and some of the other things, that those are independent tasks. And then some of the other tasks are sort of going to be in a holding pattern or sort of a development pattern, I should say, until the LEAP model is complete in August. And so that impacts the timeline for when we'll know what. So others, why don't I pause there and see if I've done a good enough job explaining that, or folks have questions, or Peter or others want to build upon what I just said.
This is Dave. I have a question. What could you go into a little bit more detail about what can happen in parallel to?
Yeah, I'm gonna.
So is that REMI modeling, and is that
no? That's what has to wait, essentially.
Yeah, I understand. I'm sorry. I should articulate my question a little better. I'm assuming because the LEAP model's there, not everything's going to be in place to do all the economic modeling we're going to want to do. But is there some economic modeling that we can do despite not having the full LEAP materials in place by August? And have we done this in the past?
Yes, there are some things we can do. And Peter, you go ahead.
Yeah, Jay, let me jump in.
Please, jump in.
There obviously are things that we can start to do in scenarios that we can start to think about. So it's not an all or nothing, but as we think about the sort of what our full charge is, and to make sure that we're conveying this sort of comparative analysis of different policy options and why we recommend things, having that full run through will be helpful. So we can certainly get an indication of what things are going to cost and where they're going to be, but doing incidence modeling about where, which households are likely to be impacted in which way, and which industries might be impacted in different ways, is not going to be possible until that model is solid.
Was there LEAP modeling? Was there REMI modeling done in concert with considerations about joining TCI, for example?
There are some REMI analyses. There are so the TCI is the policy in which we have the most data, and that will probably have more data than we have on any other policy because it's had regional modeling for years now being done on it. And so that is going to be an outlier towards the good in terms of information that we have. The other ones, we're not going to get anywhere near to that. So there's plenty of economic modeling for TCI in particular. There's a similar level for RGGI, but that's an existing program. So
I forgot the name of the prior climate plan that was, there have been numbers of them over the last few years here, but has there been REMI modeling done for those plans?
For the Vermont Climate Action Commission's final report, there wasn't any REMI analysis done on those, because it was more of a series of policy recommendations without sufficient detail to do that economic analysis.
Right. Thank you.
And I'll just say, others, maybe Jared wanted to say something, or I can't see who's flashing, but I'll just say that we'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about sort of what has to wait for the LEAP model and what can be moving forward in parallel when I illustrate the timeline later on in the agenda. Go ahead, Jared.
Thanks, Jane. I guess, and this is really important for us to kind of be on the same page about just terminology and our understanding of the different types of modeling. One of the things that has been in my mind, and I think is a shared understanding, but it's worth testing, is that there's really two types of modeling that are happening, and they're happening kind of in a sequence and on top of each other. So the first step is really the technical modeling, the sectoral modeling of the changes in technologies, best practices, efficiency, et cetera, that can actually add up to achieving our emissions reduction requirements. Then there's another set of analysis that gets built on top of that. Once we know the scale and pace of emissions reduction that's going to be required by sector and the measures that can help us get there, whether it's electrification or efficiency or biofuels. Then there's a next level analysis about what are the policy interventions, the kind of regulations, the programs that can help us, get from here to there in terms of where we would be without intervention versus what the policies and programs will need to be. And my sense is that I agree that I think the policy scenario modeling and then the kind of economic and health and other analysis that has to happen after that is likely on the longer time frame that Jane mentioned.
Mhm.
That said, I think that we know a lot about the kind of technical and sector modeling about how to achieve our emissions reduction requirements. EAN has shared with all of you our third draft of that model. My understanding from TJ and the Public Service Department is that all of the assumptions and inputs that we collected from across the state and the appropriate federal sources to use have been shared with SEI and NESCOM and built into their model, so there won't be significant disagreements between those models. And my belief is that we can do some interim analysis on those sectoral and technical pathways in terms of what does it mean for consumer savings moving off of fossil dependence in these sectors towards greater beneficial electrification and efficiency and weatherization. What is, and there's a lot of great modeling that has already been done on that to me doesn't necessarily need to wait for the identification of policy proposals, but is really just about what are the macroeconomic impacts for Vermont and what are the consumer changes, what are the changes in revenue, et cetera, if we see those big sectoral changes that are already being modeled both by EAN and with the LEAP model. So that's the type of thing that, it may not be final as soon as we would want, but I think we can start getting, and I would be curious to hear from Ken Jones. I mean, he has done some great economic impact analysis of an older version of those sectoral pathways that may be able to be built on in the short term to give us some initial kind of orientation to kind of broader economic possibilities. But I agree that when we're talking about analysis of policy proposals, that's going to be on a longer time frame.
So maybe we should go back to Jane for what you have to say, or does Ken want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do. I do just want to offer that Ken is staffing this subcommittee, and he's also now joining us at the Science and Data Subcommittee and providing that economic experience. So Ken, feel free if you want to make a comment now to do that before I jump into the details of the RFP.
Just a short comment, and that's the application of the REMI tool. It gives some information with regards to overall impacts to the state economy, but in many cases it's not that enlightening because it doesn't do distributional impacts. And one of the things that I've learned is that any sort of we'll call it public sector directed activity will almost always have a positive impact on the economy, in part because we're a small state. And if it's a state government directed activity, it's state economically it's directed to the state economy, and the alternative use of that economic activity would largely go out of state. This has little to do with climate issues and even the purchase of fossil fuels, but things like weatherization costs money, but it's all Vermont activity. So many of these projects are going to show positive impact, and whether that really helps direct the discussion or not will be, I mean, we should do it and then talk about it, but I don't want to overstate the value of that general state economic impact. But it also, I agree with Jared, a lot of this can be done without a huge amount of effort to give you a starting point for understanding economic impact.
Ken, thanks very much.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so first off, I just want to state that I'm not going to sort of dive into this with you all, but that there's sort of 3 scenarios on how this contract can go, or I should say how this RFP could be awarded in a contract. So, and I think that the way that we will structure, and I've tried to give some credence to that since the science and data meeting yesterday, but to our preference is this work could be parsed out into smaller contracts, or this work could be done by one consultant, or this work could be done, the most likely scenario is by one lead consultant who pulls in other smaller consultants who would help them meet the needs of all of the services that we're asking for. And the state's preference is clearly one contract that gets us at all of this, just purely based on a management capacity standpoint of managing multiple small contracts. So you'll remember that that was a review and recommendation that came through Jared's memo to all of you that highlighted the 3 different ways this could go. And we're really sort of migrating and favoring if whoever can put together a proposal that we can award through a single contract. And so again, I want to highlight that in addition to the sort of emissions reduction, the science that we need to meet the requirements of the goals in 2025, 30, and 50 for greenhouse gas emissions reductions. This work, this analysis also has to do with the sequestration goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And while that is kind of separate yet similar, it's all married kind of tightly with respect to the way we do our greenhouse gas inventory and the way we could do it differently, perhaps, as well as the development of the carbon budget. And we're putting that all within one proposal. I suspect that there could be discrete smaller contracts or smaller RFPs and/or grants that are also needed to meet the goals and work of the other subcommittees, particularly rural resilience, but that this work all kind of works together here for this RFP for now. And so while it's not intended to be everything that we'll need for the climate action plan, it's intended to be the bulk of it. So I just want to highlight, you've all had this, there's 6 main components of it, with the 6th being a monitoring and assessment. And you'll recall that within the RFI, there were 8 components. And really what Jared helped us do was sort of refine and organize that work a little better into these smaller number of tasks. And some of this work, like we'll meet internally to consider, like this has been raised, the first point right within the scope of services has to do with how we measure and do our greenhouse gas inventory. And this perhaps could be done by DEC within in-house, and we're going to have a discussion about that. But for now, it's sitting here within the scope of services. The carbon budget, as of yesterday, had been sort of underneath. Did someone have a question?
Sorry, Jane, this is Jared. I just wanted to pause on the first one, if that's okay, to say that just in the science and data subcommittee meeting yesterday, there was some good discussion of that, and there were some really thoughtful and helpful public comments that were made at the end. I want to take a little bit of time to see if there's any suggested kind of language to add, just in the interest of clarity and added detail there, because I think that we're working with. I think we're all trying to base our work on a couple of key pieces of statutory guidance. One is the Global Warming Solutions Act, but then there's also 10 VSA 582, which governs kind of our greenhouse gas inventory. And I think when you read that, there are some questions about methodology and approach that we want some professional technical guidance on that relate to when and how it's possible to consistently include life cycle greenhouse gas emissions inventory in an official in-boundary or territorial inventory. I realize I'm using very technical terms, but it's very complex, and I just want to make sure that we frame this up in a way that refers as directly as possible to the legal guidance that we have in those two statutes, and that helps frame up some of the areas of potential kind of areas where greater clarity would be helpful and where there may be potential inconsistency. Because I think the goal for all of us is that we have a transparent, consistent methodology that we are fully confident in, and that is helping us track progress towards and is connected to the measures that will be in the climate action plan.
So Jared, I wanted to just highlight that at noon, we are proposing to have a deeper dive on just that sort of greenhouse gas inventory calculus discussion.
Yeah.
And I think it might be worth tabling more of that. Let Jane finish here, and then we can follow up. And if there are things that we want to follow up back on relative to the RFP, then we can do that. But I think it'd be useful to keep moving.
Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for that, Jared. And yeah, I have some comments on that too, but we can save it for now. So I just wanted to highlight that the carbon budget yesterday had been sort of embedded within the greenhouse gas inventory task, and we've pulled it out separately and highlighted this and flagged this for consideration with the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee. And so Ali Kasiba and I are hopefully going to tee up a little bit of a conversation for the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee on Friday to sort of flesh out a little bit more what the sort of detail here which should be included around the development of a carbon budget. So that's forthcoming still. So it's a placeholder for right now. And then the rest has to do with what we've been discussing and really relates to all of your work more. And I'm trying to find my down on number 4. So if you haven't seen this, this really gets at considerations around the sector-based targets that Jared referred to, and thinking about the cost effectiveness and economic impact analyses around it, building off again some of the work that's already been done with the Public Service Department outside of the LEAP model, but other work that they've done within their department. And I'll just state that where some of the language, and maybe I'll pause there if folks want to recommend or consider any comments there. And I should just state that the Science and Data Committee has till Friday at the end of the day to provide me any more detailed comments that they have. And I know Christine Donovan on your subcommittee has already been really helpful in helping reshape sort of language and be clearer. And I have those comments within my inbox and haven't incorporated them yet, but others should feel like you have space to do that outside of this meeting too, if you're more comfortable to do it that way. But the one that I was flagged by Science and Data, and I asked Christine if she would be willing to sort of tee up her comments here, was number 4 within the scope of services. And Science and Data sort of punted this to your subcommittee, recognizing that this really gets at the meat of what your subcommittee will be working on over the next few months. And so, Christine, if you're willing, maybe I would just turn it over to you to offer some perspective on the comments that you put in the margin here.
Sure. Great. Thank you. And Jane and Jared and TJ have done an enormous amount of work on this. So I offered through Jared to take a look at the RFP along the way if it was helpful, with it in mind that I'm a career-long consultant who used to make my living responding to RFPs. So what I asked myself in reading this was, if I were bidding on this, would I know what the client wants, and would I know what I'm expected to provide in what form, and be committed to doing when I submit my bid. So it got me thinking, really deeply about what exactly is this language telling me based on just what's written on the page, not what I think might be in people's heads. And I also wanted to be sure, at least in my view, that this was both a modeling and a policy analysis endeavor, and also wanted to be more clear about what exactly is the difference, if any, between the work we're expecting to be done for the milestone year of 2025 versus the milestone year of 2030 versus the milestone year of 2050. And more than this number 4, I've provided a second review this morning to Jane where I went deep through this RFP with those major objectives in mind. But on the first read of number 4, last time, whenever that was, late last week, I was a little, I think I know what you want, but the language that was here didn't really do it for me as a bidder. And so I was asking, for example, the listing of bullets, programmatic and implementation activities, rules and regulations, codes and standards, conservation and efficiency programs, market transformation incentives, subsidies and or incentives, market mechanisms. I agree that I would assume we want all of those issues to be addressed. But they're not like items. So for example, with conservation and efficiency programs, I would imagine there are regulatory and or policy actions as well as programmatic and implementation activities that might need to go beyond just conservation and efficiency programs that might, for example, be addressed to housing programs or workforce development, et cetera. So I was just trying to suggest at least the logic chain that I went through is, in sort of riffing off of what Jared said earlier, ultimately at its simplest level, we got to figure out what the technology options are. We got to figure out which of them are the most cost effective. And then we got to figure out, okay, to achieve those technologies that are options most cost effectively, what are the policy, regulatory, programmatic, educational, outreach, other issues that need to happen to move those technologies to whatever scale the modeling shows we need that most cost-effective technology for. And so that was, and very importantly, I see reference to subsidies and or incentives, which to me are forms of funding, not forms of finance, and the level of investment that's going to be needed to scale to the level that we need to scale, I would imagine will be a mixture of new financing and investment strategies, as well as continued effort of funding through subsidies and or incentives in certain cases. Because ultimately what we're trying to do is use public investment to stimulate large scales of private investment. So, so that's essentially what that little bullet was all about. And I'll be quiet now.
That was extremely helpful for me. And I wonder if everybody sees what Christine is suggesting, and if so, if this is not capturing it clearly and somehow needs to be broken out better in order to reflect that sort of stepwise approach in a way that you were discussing, Christine, if perhaps I could work with you outside of this to sort of ensure that we have this right.
Other comments from the committee? I just like to make sure that as we have this discussion that we keep in mind 2 things. That in this instance, we're asking consultants to look at a range of issue areas and as Christine said, technologies and different types of policy interventions, all 3, to help us, kind of winnow down the huge amount of policy options that exist in the world to the ones that are best for Vermont and most likely to meet our deadlines or statutory mandates for 2025, 2030. And that is a different exercise from a modeling exercise that we were talking about a few minutes ago to assess the distributional and macroeconomic impacts of policies once they're decided upon. And I want to make sure that we understand in the process we're going through right now, that we're looking for consultants who are going to be doing the first bit of this, helping us to focus on the strategies or policy interventions that we think would be best for Vermont. And yeah, we have to have an eye on the latter kind of analysis. What's it going to cost? What are the distributional impacts, et cetera. But we want somebody to help us do the first thing too. And Christine, I don't know how the committee wants to proceed. You know, we could deputize Christine or Christine and Jared or, you know, any other volunteers to work with Jane on how this is literally drafted. But while we're talking about it, it's useful also to plant a flag on a second issue, which is that our task discussion groups and task leaders have a great deal of expertise in these fields. And they have a pretty good idea of who among the potential bidders or consultants might be really good to help us.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I wouldn't want to do is hire a prime consultant and give them carte blanche to hire whoever the subs are.
Nope. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think our committee would want to have some input with working with the prime on who are you going to get to help us in transportation? Who are you going to get to help us in housing or weatherization or, you know, pick your topic. And it would be nice to have that understood and written into our plan of practice. And
Yes.
I'm inviting comments on any of the above.
Well, I will just say that that team of whoever would be doing the work would have to be articulated in the proposal and approved. So that will all have to be part of the original proposal that comes in for the subs and who would be part of that sort of dream team of consultants. So that will be available for you all to review when we make the selection, prior to making the selection.
Any other comments on? So you're, Jane, you're expecting that would be baked into the
Yeah, it's part of the proposal format. They have to actually list out all of the folks who will be on the team, as well as their approach to completing the work and who the multiple consultants would be.
Right. Okay. So yep. Is there any way that our input can be solicited in order to help guide that, or did you just think that's a bad idea? I mean,
well, no, it would be wonderful, like for the outreach and engagement contract, the Just Transitions subcommittee, probably half of that subcommittee, well, 4 of them sat on the review and ranking team for the proposals, and I could see the same sort of role for members of the cross sector or the science and data with respect to reviewing and ranking the proposals that come in to assist the state in selecting and awarding the contract.
Okay, so that would our input could happen at that point.
Yes.
Jared and Joey want to speak. Jared?
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, I just want to say I agree with and really appreciate with how you framed that, Christine, and then also Rich. One other thing that I just want to identify for discussion, because I don't think it's fully there in this draft, which is like mostly on me, because I think I took the first cut at that section, is I think we want to be clear to what extent we're asking consultants to do analysis on policies and kind of strategies that the cross-sector mitigation committee is identifying through our task leads through those 4 kind of task groups, versus to what degree we're asking them to kind of assess the kind of global big universe and recommend policies. My sense is that what we're really doing is this subcommittee has a lot of expertise to do that and has done some of that initial scanning about what are some of the what is our initial sense about some of the high impact, beneficial potential policy options that we would then want the consultant to assess for us, not them to come to us and tell us these are the policies you should do. I don't think we want to be too dogmatic about that. I mean, certainly I think we want to be open to, you know, hearing about policy measures and ideas that they might identify that we might not. But I think we do want to be clear here that we're asking them to start with the suite of policy measures that emerge from and get identified as a starting point from this subcommittee. And I don't think that that's yet clearly enough stated in here.
Yeah. Do you, I mean, to me, Jared, number 5 sort of gets at that interaction, but perhaps it doesn't get it.
So I think develop is probably not the
right
maybe
word.
It is, but I think we want to be clear that they're not starting from scratch, that there'll be inputs coming out of this subcommittee.
Yeah. Thank you.
Joey?
So that was pretty much exactly what I was going to raise. So thank you for beating me to it. And I think that clarification and that iterative approach is important, but I do think they won't be starting from scratch, just like we are not starting from scratch. One other just question for you, since we clarified that, which was my substantive one, is just in terms of the 3 sort of approaches you laid out, Jane, and the potential like preferred approach in terms of like one Uber contract and then they hire others with maybe more in-depth expertise. They in the RFP, and they are charged with sort of putting that dream team together. And I'm just wondering if there's, you know, in the transportation work that I'm doing, I think there are consultants out there who the transportation arena is like really their wheelhouse of expertise. And I'm curious what sort of opportunity we might have to help sort of create a dream team.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you for that. There is a period of questions and back and forth with consultants that definitely took place for the engagement and outreach contract. And I don't think in that case I was ever asked specifically to help facilitate sort of relationship building for them to team up with others, but I could see that especially with this work and funneling that to all of you to help guide that. And I think that would be an appropriate way. I certainly think any consultant who's interested in bidding on a contract of this scale will make an introduction before submitting a proposal, and we'll have a feedback loop with the state. It's just a way to get your foot in the door, and that certainly happened with every single one of the facilitation and outreach and engagement contracts. So I think that is a really great understanding to know that you all have contacts and to help facilitate that relationship building along the way as they develop proposals. And I just wanted one other comment on all of that is you may or may not have noticed, and this was a point of discussion with the Science and Data Committee yesterday about the appropriate role of the subcommittees in interacting with this contractor. So I'll just say that in the outreach and engagement contract, that consultant is it will be required to meet regularly with the Just Transition subcommittee. In fact, attending all the meetings for the first few months in order to inform and develop their public engagement strategy. And so in this case, we thought about sort of how that relationship would work with the Science and Data Committee, recognizing that yes, the Science and Data Committee would be a place where they would receive preliminary results and respond to, but that wasn't the only role of the Science and Data Committee. It would also help inform the methodologies and the work plan for the consultant. And you'll notice that that sort of intentional relationship is set up with the Science and Data Subcommittee, but I also articulated your subcommittee, the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee and the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee, and specifically said where necessary that there would be a relationship, recognizing that we don't want them just meeting with subcommittees all the time, but there's probably some clear moments, and that would be good for you all to be thinking about in your work planning, as well as me thinking about how I craft the RFP, about where those touch points are with this subcommittee for the work with the technical analysis. And I'd be happy to work with Peter and Richard on that and work that in, or if others have comments, just thinking about your role long-term with this contractor.
Thanks, Jane. I think that it will be important to build that in. We can discuss how. I have David and then Christine.
Thank you, Rich. When I'm looking at number 4 here, I'm not sure if what I'm interested is included in reducing greenhouse gas emissions consistent with the requirements of Act 153, or along the lines of pathways identified by the SEI NESCOM in the LEAP modeling exercise for CEP. They may be included, but what I'm thinking about transportation and things that are beyond Vermont's control, but that could be really significant in reaching carbon goals for the transportation sector here. For instance, other states adopting ZEV rules, or federal CAFE standards being changed, clean fuel standards being changed. So my question is, would those sorts of federal things that are really important in this specific instance, would those be included and be part of what a contractor would be looking at?
I guess I don't really know how to answer that. If others have, the sort of boundary of the analysis has been a conversation point. And I think that probably needs to happen more sooner rather than later. But, we're really responsible for the emissions generated here in Vermont and around the policies and mechanisms that we can control and have an influence on here in Vermont. And that doesn't preclude us from advocating for strong federal leadership, but how that actually plays into the modeling and work, I don't know exactly. Peter, Jared, do you have any thoughts on that?
So my feeling is that it has to be included, Dave, since there's the interplay at all levels, especially with we don't have the ability to set our own separate fuel efficiency standards, for example. So it would have to include either federal CAFE standards, or if we were continuing to follow the California model. And so I think that has to be part of it. And so I don't think there's a way around that. So if that's not captured in here, then we certainly need to adjust that, because we're already operating in ways that are already influenced by federal policy. So
right.
Yeah, Dave, I would say, to the extent that you're talking about taking on board things that are happening outside Vermont, sure, it should be included as part of the world that we live in. But I don't think you meant that we should be including in our policy prescriptions a list of things that we want to ask Congress to do.
That's correct.
So,
well,
I want to ask, but that's really not our charge.
Right. Thank you.
So that does raise that raises a deeper question that we're going to have to wrestle with about the appropriateness of the level of action, or whether or not we can assume things are coming. Because if we were to assume that all of the infrastructure money that is currently proposed, that came out yesterday, was part of our, sort of our overall global milieu, we would have a different series of recommendations than we would if there's none of that money. And so trying to grapple with that is going to be, in fact, probably the most complicated piece we get into, and what this administration is going to do versus what previous administrations did, to understand that sort of where Vermont, it changes our sort of our reference case pretty dramatically.
And we may need to adjust to that as the months go on. I have Christine and then Gina comments.
Just going back a little bit about the potential interaction between the consultant and the subcommittees. In the edits I sent into Jane, suggested edits I sent into Jane this morning, I suggested specific wording to assume that there'd be, at least, for purposes of scoping and budgeting, 3 interactions between the consultant and each of the 3 additional committees beyond science and data, thinking that presumably we'd want to have an opportunity to talk to the consultants fairly early on to give them our key policy ideas and get their initial feedback. Then presumably midstream at some point when they've done their initial work and have their own ideas about which policy priorities. And then a third time, presumably, perhaps once they have done, completed their work and we're providing feedback directly to them based on their work. I didn't get that granular in the comments to Jane, but that was my thinking about assuming there would likely be 3. And better to assume 3 so they're prepared for that than to say it may or may not happen and then they're not prepared. So that was just my take on that.
Thank you for that.
I think that's a good suggestion, Christine. I mean, we've all had experience with consultants who sort of either misunderstood the policy ideas that are under consideration and then modeled them in a way that was just inappropriate, or where they had ideas that would have helped us early on to change our own thinking, and that's both of those things have happened to me. So I like your suggestion. Gina?
Hi, I want to emphasize, I think what Peter was saying about transportation particularly is subject to federal policies and funding, and it's a national market for vehicles, and all of that background has to go into the analysis. The roadway network, we're part of a larger network. So you have to look beyond the state's borders when you're looking at changing what we're doing, because the push and pull of the influences outside are huge. And then I would also say it wouldn't be a list to Congress, but it might be working with other states on moving that needle. And that's where things like TCI become really important, NESCOM become really important. So in that list under 4, I would like to see regional networks or partnerships or some wording that refers to these larger issues outside our boundaries.
Great suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Gina.
Can
we having a great conversation. We're a little behind time. Have all the committee members who wanted to address this spoken, or is there somebody else? Okay.
It would be really beneficial, Richard, if you could you just call the question on process for reworking number 4? I heard you suggest Christine, perhaps, and Jared sort of like helping me finesse that language there to get at what we've discussed today. And I would appreciate that if that feels right with the committee. Yeah, thank you.
I'm asking, I'm seeing heads nodding. All right, let's do that. And I will stay in touch with Christine and Jared myself as well.
And of course, the door's open for wordsmithing, edits, any other questions, comments, just send them to me via email. Okay,
thanks, Jane. I realize it's a big task. So
to someone who
we're acknowledging that as we encourage you forward.
Thank you.
Christine?
Jane, can you just summarize briefly what the timeline is for that work we just talked about?
Yesterday, I don't know. The way the timeline is written within the RFP is that I would like to get this out and posted by the end of next week.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've got a couple more thorny topics to get into. So I think it's again, back to you, Jane, on the modeling timeline.
Yeah, and I don't think this has to, I know we're over time already, so let me just share this more as an educational point than anything. So you'll all remember, and I was envious, I'll say, of TJ's like snazzy timeline for the comprehensive energy plan. And so recognizing that first and foremost, that we're moving towards the development of a climate action plan outline and structure. That will be a substantive discussion at the steering committee meeting this afternoon. And that will get at sort of the deep level of detail and questions around what will be provided for in this first plan. And in order to do that, I think that an understanding and acknowledgement of what we will know and when we will know it, in order to build the timeline and details around the outline of the plan, was an understanding of the analysis that we certainly need for the first plan, and when we will have those analyses ready, and what, as we've alluded to earlier today in the conversation, what can happen independent of the LEAP model and what sort of needs to wait for that to happen. And I'll just highlight another sort of critical component that came up at the council meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, was really around engagement. And I'm here sort of recognizing and hearing loud and clear, not only from Just Transitions, which that's their job to advocate for, but really from the full council, how critical and how important public engagement is in this process. And so I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more with you all today, and I have some ideas and recommendations on how task leads could plug into that. But I'll just suggest that, you know, it's important to recognize on this timeline what we won't know at the points we've sort of identified for public engagement. And I just recognize that I fully appreciate that to go out to the public in the fall with a climate action plan draft that is not informed by economics yet to the full breadth of how it could be, could raise challenges, it could propose challenges. So that's sort of this timeline, and this discussion around what will happen with engagement will be taken up at the Just Transitions Committee meeting next week per their work plan. And so this is to sort of preview that conversation with all of you. But where we're sort of marching full steam ahead right now with is the recognition and approval of the RFP and the issuing of that still within sort of early April. And so my hope is that my hope had been to get it out tomorrow, this week, that we would sort of have a clear draft of the RFP that would be approved by the steering committee today to advance. But I'm mindful of that. I'm hopeful that the steering committee will approve the process that we have in place to finalize the RFP, and will advance that next week. I really don't think that it'll be reasonable, with the recognition and understanding of the review and approvals that need to happen at the state, that we will have those contracts and the contract in place before early May, if not even perhaps later at this point. Just seeing how long it's taking to sign a contract for the engagement and outreach. So mindful of that, I think there is still work specifically around the greenhouse gas inventory, which you'll start to talk about today, the carbon budget methodology, that can all be happening independent of actually having a contract in place. Those conversations have the expertise within the subcommittees and within DEC to help facilitate. So along those lines, I think we'll also have conversations, especially with Just Transitions and Rural Resilience, perhaps around other discrete technical analyses contracts that we might want to issue and work towards through the month of May. So the rest of the work sort of highlights sort of how and what will be coming out of the comprehensive energy plan model. So you've seen this with TJ's presentation and timeline, but we will have a business as usual case coming out in May for you all to look at and digest. The Science and Data Committee, you are all thought of as stakeholders in that process, and we'll be able to inform that moving forward into a final form in early June. I also think there'll be a lot of conversation and consideration around the non-energy sector work, as that's not robust yet in the comprehensive energy plan work that's happening. And then we'll be sort of moving through and hopefully be able to sort of capture and analyze the carbon budget component pretty quickly once the contract is in place, recognizing that a lot of the pre-work will be done by the subcommittees. So again, the only other thing sort of to identify and sort of rectify in everybody's mind is that the TJ keeps cautioning me, but it's an ambitious timeline, but they've committed to completing the LEAP model by August 13th. That is the deadline in their contract. And that is sort of when we would be able to advance and initiate the sort of more complex, robust economic modeling at that point, meaning that we won't have that analysis till September, end of September earliest, but probably more like October. So that's what I have with respect to this. I'm happy to sort of facilitate any questions, but really I wanted this to help inform your work planning as well as sort of the input and recognition of where and what we'll know for public engagement around the timeline that we've set for ourselves. Happy to leave this up for questions or take down, or go ahead.
Thanks, Jane. Any questions or comments? I mean, I have a basic takeaway from this, Jane, which is that we, as we've said a couple times, we just need to go ahead with our work, and develop good ideas for Vermont as quickly as we can that we know have been, particularly those that have been analyzed in depth in parallel processes. And take those to the public, knowing that we're going to be proceeding in a kind of iterative fashion. They will be draft proposals, they will be preliminary proposals, they will be good ideas at that point, and then we will run them through additional analysis to check our work and perhaps modify it. But we are not going to wait till August in order to actually start doing the heavy lifting. So that's my reaction to what I've just heard. Joey and Jared, I see your hands are
up. Thanks, Rich, and thanks, Jane, for that overview and lots of good work underway. I just want to sort of echo and underscore what Rich just said and noted, and in terms of early public engagement, especially around, the things that we generally, we know we need to do, like deep efficiency and weatherization and significant change in our transportation sector, a lot of electrification, fuel efficiency, transportation demand. I mean, we could potentially, and I don't know what this looks like, but a lot of my work is grounded in public engagement, and I firmly believe in this being an iterative process with Vermonters. It seems like we could go out with some of those buckets of and have some sort of process where we're getting early ideas before a draft plan in June. And then I just saw, I haven't looked into it, but it sounds like the Just Transition Subcommittee is doing some sort of early public engagement, and that just wanting to be coordinated and synergized, just wanting to understand that better. And is there an opportunity to, anyway, just we could either potentially do something separate or something in conjunction.
Thanks, Joey. I think we need to talk with the other committee to find out what would be best. Don't want to preempt important work that they may want to be doing. On the other hand, it may very well be helpful in support of their work if they heard from us, or if we were somehow jointly communicating with members of the public to provide some more context on where the plan might be going. And as opposed to just showing up and saying, well, blank slate, tell us what you think. Folks may appreciate that opportunity. They may also appreciate, well, what am I responding to? So it could be that we need to just work with Just Transitions and in the public outreach arena to see what works best, recognizing they have their own ideas about what's best. Jared and then Peter.
Thanks for laying this out, Jane. I do want to, and this connects back to our RFP discussion, but I think that there may be a missing piece on this timeline, which is I fully understand why some of the economic modeling that's dependent on the development of policy scenarios will likely have to wait until, the end of the summer. On the right-hand side of this graphic, I do think, and it would be good to be clear here on this timeline and in the RFP, that we can do economic analysis that's not just about the business as usual base case, but that would be about being able to give us insight about some of the economic impacts of meeting our sectoral targets via the technology pathways. I think that is able to be done on a shorter time frame. That's a different type of economic analysis than the policy scenario analysis. But I mean, there's a lot of information that we already have and that is ready to go in terms of, it's very basic stuff about, dollars in and out of state, consumer costs versus savings, differences in kind of switching from fossil to electric. I mean, a lot of that information is ready to go to be able to assess if we do the scale of sectoral and technological change that we know we need. What are some of the broad characterizations of the economic impacts of that? I think that's something that can be paired with the analysis of the business as usual in May. That may be a topic for further discussion. The other thing I would say, because it's also listed here at the top of the month of May list, and the more I look at it and think about it, I don't think it's currently sufficiently addressed in the RFP, and maybe a worthy topic of discussion is, I'm confident based on EAN's work and based on the LEAP modeling work that we're going to have a really good sense of the measures and pathways to look at for energy sector emissions reduction, the 79% of our emissions that come from the energy sectors. It's not clear to me, especially I feel like TJ has previously said that it's, and maybe this is not a fair characterization, maybe you, Jane, or Peter can speak to this, but my sense is that their wheelhouse, their specific expertise is not as much in the non-energy emissions reduction area. So I think we want to be as clear as possible, both here and in the RFP, where the kind of measures and pathways that are not about the energy sectors, where those come from and how they get fed into the model, and what we're asking our consultants to do in coordination with, say, the non-energy subgroup here in this subcommittee, and also in coordination with potentially ag and ecosystems.
Thanks, Jared. Peter?
So I think this is a great conversation, and I think we're all sort of saying the same thing, which is, but maybe in slightly different ways. And I just want to see if I can kind of sum up for us. We have a lot of work to do to identify, flesh out, further develop policies that have the potential to help us achieve our results. In order to prove our work, the modeling needs to occur to be able to get there, and that goes to more of the policy components rather than just the technology analysis, which we have some of that already in hand. What I appreciate that timeline showing us is the pinch points along the way, so that we know what we're going to be able to provide when, or what we're all going to have when, in order to be able to make decisions, so that we can attune various parts of our work to like the scale of what's needed, so that we know how much to pull on one lever versus another. And I think so, to me, it's really useful to have those things out. We can be developing all of our policies throughout the spring and early summer and get in a really good shape, and then have that dovetail really nicely into the modeling analysis, and then get to the further economic analysis as we go into the fall, so that we can have that full package of analysis done, that I think that I anticipate us wanting to have to feel confident in our work. And so it's really helpful to see that and see, frankly, where if we don't deliver on what we need to do, regardless of the RFPs and the modeling piece, where things potentially fall down. So thanks, Jane.
Thanks, Peter. It's a good summary. I think we may be through with this at the moment. We have an action item, which we've already decided, and we look forward to hearing back from you guys about it. The wonderful RFP that got crafted and got sent out. And I gather that the subcommittee would like to be involved in reviewing the proposals when they come back in, and we will have to probably deputize a couple of people to represent us in that process. So
yeah, certainly I think we have a time challenge where we might appreciate the 90% solution with that happens sooner rather than the 94% solution that happens later. So I do think deputizing a few and us being willing to accept their good work is probably a good place to be.
Yeah, okay, we will do that. We do have a really interesting conversation on the inventory discussion, and I suspect that the afternoon agenda can be done faster than we've scheduled here. So I'm wondering whether we should take our break now and come back for the inventory question. That makes sense, everybody?
I think that sounds like a good plan. I'm sure everybody is ready for a little break.
Now, you've got a half-hour break scheduled in here. Are we still good with that?
I have it as 15
Oh, no,
minutes.
15 minutes. Thank you. Okay, 15 minutes appropriate.
15 minutes appropriate.
We'll see you back at 12:45.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
So Christine, is that Spanish moss I see behind you?
It is.
Cut it out. It's spitting snow here.
I know that. That's
Oh
why
my
I'm
gosh.
here.
I hear you.
When do you arrive in the right portion of the continent?
We're targeting between May 10th and 15th, sort of around when it gets green. Yeah, so around then. Very slow camp back, six weeks or so.
Oh my, that's sweet.
It is. It's quite lovely. I'm very grateful for it. And it's amazing. Well, you know this because you guys work all over the world, but you know, I had to Zoom book group last night. One person was in Hawaii. Just amazing how we can interact now.
Yeah, it is. It is amazing. We have RAP has the wonderful challenge of trying to figure out what time of day or night to hold meetings.
Yeah.
The sun never sets on RAP.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have a critical mass back? Hey, Liz.
I think we do. No, maybe.
Okay. Okay.
So shall I get into the inventory discussion? This is really just a tee up.
Is that for you to tee up, Peter?
Yes.
All right.
It's a tee up, and I think it's a you know, the Science and Data Committee will dig deeper. You saw it in the RFP. As Colin Smythe was going through the inventory with the council back in meeting 2 or whenever that was, there were lots of questions and good ones posed about sort of what about these types of emissions? What about this? You know, what about the life cycle analysis? What about, you know, sort of consumption based, sort of what is our system as a whole cost us in terms of emissions? And I think those are all relevant questions. The inventory as it's set up does not track those things. There's also sort of what is the relationship between sequestration and opportunities and our emissions? And you know, we in Act 153 have both the pleasure and the curse of having the emissions reductions requirements be the thing to which we are held to account. We, the government of the state of Vermont, held account. And then it also has a net zero goal. Well, if we were to just calculate sort of net emissions, then we would get there. We would get to net zero by well before 2050. And so they're just, the way we count matters, and what we count and what we look at. I know, Jared, you've suggested some ideas around doing more, you know, not to have the sort of official inventory, but then sort of other factors that we ought to consider in terms of the outside of boundary sort of emissions. That is a good discussion to have. I think I'll sort of reflect on the resources for a moment and suggest that does require a fair amount of additional analysis, and we are light in the staffing support there. So that should be a consideration of the council as they're going through it, to not create expectations that can't be met. And then think about sort of what are you going to use that information for, and how is it going to define policy choices to some extent, should be part of the factor. So if the way we count now has implications on what policies we might select, because we're going to drive it towards the things that we need to reduce. If we were to think about things differently, then that might affect policy choices. It also may bring into more of those issues of sort of out of state boundary sort of decisions, and how do we track and calculate those things? So I just wanted to flag that this is a rich conversation, and the DEC, which is responsible for that, has no expectation that the situation is perfect and answers all the needs. It's without sort of a bubble over us that can accurately calculate all of our emissions. We're sort of figuring out the best we can with what we've got, and it's based on analysis that was done in 2007 and tracked the sort of the thinking at the time. Obviously, different states have evolved over time, but just wanted to sort of flag that as it's an area rich for discussion.
Jared, have you raised your hand?
Oh, sorry. I think that was still up from before.
Oh, it's just up.
But since you recognize me, Rich, I may just quickly take the opportunity to just give an example around what Peter was just saying and how important it is getting clarity of definitions and just transparency and consistency and confidence about the entire approach and the implications for policy. When we were recently updating, I think all of you have received the third draft of EAN's emissions reduction pathways analysis. For instance, one of the things that came up for us is that if you want biofuels to be a pathway around emissions reduction, then you need to use life cycle emissions factors, because currently the way that the state of Vermont conducts our emissions inventory, it is the direct emissions from combustion at the burner tip on most of our transportation and thermal fuels. And really the only way you get a net emissions reduction in switching from fossil fuels to biofuels is if you're looking at the difference in their life cycle emissions. However, when you do that, you are then factoring in emissions that are produced throughout the life cycle, or from well to wheel, as it were. And many of those emissions happen in other states. Certainly in the case of fossil fuel, because it's 100% imported into Vermont. And so I think that there are some really just fundamental important questions that we need to get clear on in terms of to what extent we can and it's appropriate to use life cycle accounting in the current methodology versus to what extent there would need to be a kind of side-by-side consumption-based inventory to allow us to look at life cycle accounting in a way that doesn't get to double counting. That's a key consideration for kind of emissions inventories, is to avoid double counting. So that's just one example, and we could go into more. I don't think we necessarily have the time to, but why it's really important to get clarity on these things, because that may be a key strategy or pathway that either would or would not show up in our policy set of options and scenarios around biofuels, depending on how things get counted.
So Jared, that's a good example, and one in which there are simple solutions and then there are harder solutions. A simple solution for that sort of piece could be that we don't count the non-fossil fuel component of those fuels. That's, for example, in the TCI analysis, that's what was considered. So the anything that was a biofuel component of on-road diesel or gasoline wasn't counted as part of the overall cap as we consider that piece. So you could make a change that was simpler. It obviously leaves out the factors of the issues associated with the generation of those biofuels, but it also doesn't make a relative comparison in the long run between the production of those biofuels versus fossil fuels. It just says, we on par or on balance think biofuels have merit at that point. We do the same thing now in the inventory for, say, for landfill gas. We don't count the CO2, I'm getting myself confused here, but let's go to biomass. We don't count the CO2 right now from the burning of biomass because we assume that it's lessened sequestration from the wood that was harvested, which is the one area where we really get into net emissions in a way that is a little bit different than the others. But there are accounting methods we can use to support those prioritizations of different technology or uses, but those are all value judgments.
Any other comments on this one? I mean, I would simply observe that it would be a shame if, realistic fossil emission pathways were, fossil emission alternatives were constrained off of our solution set by the way that we counted them. So if Vermont-based sustainably harvested biomass is counted only at the burner tip and therefore looks like it's not a solution just because of the way we count, it seems to me that would be a mistake. Consistent with what Peter just said, and that's this. What do you think? Are we deferring to science and data on how the inventory, is going to be constructed and what's going to get counted?
I think so generally, but my perspective is we're the sort of users of that data, and so we need to understand how the math happens so that we can understand how it impacts the policy choices that we make. So, Reg, I would say like the one sort of objective pushback to the wood, for example, is that we are not accounting for the carbon emissions, the CO2 emissions from the burning of wood currently. And so, it creates if we were to drive a lot of wood burning, which, we just need to be aware of the fact that there are CO2 emissions from that. And if we're only talking about emissions reductions, we currently aren't counting those. There's obviously other benefits and other opportunities to count more holistically, but we just need to be aware of those.
But yeah, I understand that point.
So I think I would just ask each of the leads to sort of probe your emissions inventory, and we're happy to have Colin Smythe kind of dig into those details with you and see what questions you have, what things wouldn't be how you would want to count it if we had an ideal way to account for it, and see what opportunities there are, because I do think it will impact policy development.
Right. And similarly, if we're not counting life cycle emissions in the baseline, but we do count life cycle emissions in the solution set, we have a mismatch.
Well, I mean, if we're accounting for, if our modeling is doing the business well, yeah.
Just
Christine and then Jared.
Christine, we can't hear you for some reason.
You're muted.
She just unmuted. I'm not sure what happened.
Oh, sorry.
There we go.
I was busy lowering my hand. Do we know what would be considered the best practice in other jurisdictions that happen to be further along than us?
So I wouldn't say that any others are further along or less far along. They've taken a slightly different approach. And that's part of the challenge. There are some states that do a little mix of both, where they provide the sort of in-boundary burner tip sort of analysis and some of that broader reach based on sort of consumption as a whole. But the consumption is generally sort of advisory in nature. And so frankly, Christine, you would get frustrated at the lack of consistency across different states and countries. Just one of the problems globally that we face.
Jared and Andrew.
And just quickly on the question of the role of the Science and Data Committee as our liaison there, I'll just say that in the draft work plan that TJ Poor, the co-chair of that subcommittee, presented yesterday, it does put up front, starting in the next couple of weeks, kind of an understanding of a deeper understanding of the current inventory methodology, the inputs, the assumptions, a presentation from Colin and DEC on that. But there is the expectation in our work plan that we will be further understanding and analyzing and kind of, perhaps working with them and making some, identifying some of the issues and potential areas where recommendations may be made. And I think, just so you all know that it is planned to be started by the Science and Data Subcommittee, and I'll be happy along with Jane and anybody else to help be a contact between these two subcommittees as that progresses. There's appropriate kind of knowledge of and review of what's happening there.
Thanks, Jared. But let me ask another, specific question, just so I understand what might be in contemplation. Suppose we assume, for the sake of this, that electricity in Vermont is zero emitting. And suppose we were modeling converting natural gas or fuel oil heat from fossil to electricity. When we consider the savings, the tons avoided by that action, will we consider the life cycle tons? That is the upstream emissions that are reduced, as well as, wellhead emissions, et cetera, and leakage down the pipeline, as well as the burner tip. And that could be will be a larger number than if we just counted the burner tip reductions. On the other hand, what are we comparing that to? If we didn't count upstream emissions in the baseline, we're doing something that looks like we're avoiding a larger fraction of tons than we actually are avoiding. Do you know which way Science and Data is thinking about dealing with this problem? You either, the legislation asks us to look at emissions outside Vermont caused by consumption in Vermont. So we can't avoid the question.
And I'd say it's an important question that needs to be tackled. I don't know as though the committee or anybody has a recommendation right now, but just to further refine it, I would say, I think that there's when we talk about energy, emissions caused from energy consumption in Vermont, the current inventory does account for the electricity emissions as a result of our in-state purchases of electricity, even if that electricity is purchased out of state. But when we look at, and that's REC accounting in compliance with the res, there's other questions about, are there, other sources that should be used for that accounting aside from the RECs, the renewable energy credits that go along with that power. That's a separate conversation. But what I want to say right now is that we are not currently accounting for the emissions from transportation and thermal fossil fuel use that occur out of state as a result of our in-state use of gasoline and diesel and fuel oil and propane. So I think it's also important that we get consistency if we're going to use life cycle analysis. And if we're going to try to account for the emissions that happen out of state for one energy source, like we've been trying to do for electricity, we would want to make sure that that's consistent with transportation and thermal emissions as well. I'm not saying that I think anybody has identified the exact answer yet, but I agree that it's an important question, and that's just one example of where we would want to achieve clarity and consistency.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this topic? Peter, you look like you want to respond.
No, well, I have all lots of things. I could talk about this all day because I think it's fascinating. So I would suggest that we probably spend enough time on this topic, and we just need to all be aware of it and aware of the value choices that get made, and whether we want to see updates to that run through the Science and Data Subcommittee for consideration by the full council. It ultimately probably will not have a direct impact on this climate action plan, as it won't be done in time to impact that, but it would set us up for future analysis going forward. So I think we could probably move on from this topic.
Okay. Colin, you had your hand up. I'd like to give you a chance to comment.
Thank you, Rich. I'm sorry. I just wanted to clarify one thing on Jared's point there. In that the electricity sector, it does include it's a consumption-based emissions estimate. And so it does include the generation from out of state. It's a little bit different because it still only includes the burner tip, if you will, emissions that occur out of state. And so it's not actually a full kind of a life cycle analysis. I just wanted to make that clarification that it's not quite as straightforward as that, but
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. You're right, Peter. We could talk about it all day, and people do talk about it all week, frequently enough. All right. Thanks very much. And we look forward to hearing more back from Science and Data. And I'm sure I like, Peter, your point. I think it was your point that we should, as we pursue our tasks and we think about particular policies that we might be proposing, that we identify these inventory, counting, measuring questions that go along with any particular policy intervention. And there are just 100 different instances in which these wrinkles arise, and it should be part of our thinking. Oh, how does this affect how we would count savings from implementing this initiative? So that's just a heads up to us as we design any of our policy interventions or choose pathways, that we identify those questions that go with it. Thanks, everybody. Now we have a couple of opportunities for task leads to share with us. I put this on the agenda just so that we would have a routine of sharing with the full subcommittee what's been happening in each of the task discussions. And there are two issues here. One is, what have you been doing, and what are the identified lead policies, topics that you all are looking at? And then second, I wanted to kick off a conversation about public engagement, soliciting good ideas from Vermonters as we go, both before, during, and after the formal public outreach process that the council as a whole is going to be engaging in. So I'm asking the task leads to comment on both of those things in the next few minutes.
Rich, can I jump in for the first topic, which is the public and stakeholder engagement piece? I think what we had envisioned was having Jane give us sort of a update on there's now an opportunity, a forum for public input into the process, right, Jane? And then Kelly, if we could talk a little bit about where the Just Transition Subcommittee is with this sort of outreach strategy. Just because we want all, I think the important part for my mind is making sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the type and expected volume / content of our public engagement at the task lead level, because we are really getting into some really hard substantive policy areas, and we want to make sure that we're being inclusive in that process.
Well said. So, Jane, I think it's to you.
Thank you. So I put together a few slides on the engagement contract, but mindful of time, I might just start by trying to explain where we are, and then have that as backup if you all want to go deeper, but I don't want to take so much time that we move towards the end of the meeting without allowing space to consider your role in that and the work that task leads have been doing. So I've alluded to it earlier today, but we've had some challenges back and forth with trying to get the contract set up, which sort of pushed us back a week in our work with the Just Transitions group. There's 3 main components of the contract that we're moving forward with. And for folks, if you don't know, the main lead consultant that we'll be working with is Climate Access. There are 2 other components, or consultants, I should say, that were brought in to help facilitate the work as well. One was Wire Consulting, Wire Media, I should say, and one was a consultant called RISE, which works on race, equity, and environmental issues. And so Climate Access will be the main consultant, and those 2 others were brought in with respect to their expertise on particular areas of the RFP. And so for everybody's benefit, there was the 3 main components had to do with the website creation that we want to launch for the Climate Council's work and ongoing work, and the role of that website in being a tool to get feedback from the public in real time around our work. Second had to do with the public engagement process itself. And you'll all remember that there were 2 strategic points along the way, both June and October, where there's a defined role with respect to public engagement, but also recognizing that if we are to build a just and equitable plan from the onset, that will require going out to the public before we have strategies and recommendations in place to hopefully help the public inform what those strategies and recommendations should be. And so there's this public engagement component of their contract, which I would argue is probably the largest part of their contract at this point. And then there's a communication strategy. So social media platforms, tools, and ways that we communicate the work that you're all doing with the public, both up until December 1st and then ongoing after the plan is drafted and created. So that, as I alluded to, as we were talking about the technical services component and your role in helping shepherd that process forward, the Just Transitions Committee has a really integral part with respect to shaping the work through Climate Access. And that first and foremost will start with what the public engagement process looks like. And as soon as they sign the contract, first and foremost, they've articulated ideas and tools and strategies on how to go out to different sectors of the population in Vermont to garner feedback and understanding about where we need to go with this work. And so that was supposed to happen. This is actually really well timed, I think, because that was originally supposed to happen at our meeting tonight with the Just Transitions, where that both our Director of Communications at the agency, LOKC, and that contractor, Climate Access, was going to join the Just Transitions Committee this evening to talk about and advance those conversations about how we move forward with public engagement. Because we were delayed, that's the agenda for next Thursday night's meeting. So we have sort of a week to think about how to broaden perhaps that meeting to engage with all of you, perhaps even in a listening forum to have you come in, be able to provide input, or think about Kelly's role in bringing that back to all of you as a liaison with Just Transitions. So they will have an intimate and ongoing seat at the table with the Just Transitions Committee. And whether it's your participation in the meeting next week to be thinking about your work in particular, as you will be thinking about and formulating some of the most challenging strategies and recommendations, in sitting in with that meeting from the onset, or whether it's Kelly's role back and forth. I think this is a great time to be starting to think about engagement, both through the tools that will be at your disposal, which is the contract, or your own engagement and work through the work of your task leads in bringing in and inviting opinions into the circle about getting input. So I'm happy to go through, but just for your all, so you can be thinking about it, I shared with you the proposal that Climate Access put in and that was selected, and then also shared with you sort of the work that Elle and I have been leading on taking what they proposed and moving it into the scope of work for their contract. And I'll just say that the only thing that's really changed around what they proposed versus what you'll see in the scope of work is the sort of detail around what it will look like to work with the Just Transition Subcommittee, as well as we've taken quite a bit out of the contract on the web creation because of some holdups with ADS, unfortunately. So they'll help us with developing content, but ADS will actually be working with us to advance putting that website up and training in-house folks to manage the content on the website. But that doesn't preclude Climate Access from actually developing sort of what the online tools will look like to engage with the public around the development and implementation of the Climate Action Plan. So I'll leave it at that, and please ask any questions, and I encourage you to look at the materials I sent around and think about how your work fits into all of that.
Thanks, Jane. Kelly, do you have anything you'd like to add or a request to this committee about how we can, plug in usefully and really help the public engagement process to be productive?
Also, as Jane said, Just Transitions hasn't really gotten very far in designing anything, but that's an opportunity for this committee to be able to say, these would be really helpful. There was talk earlier of, let's not just say, hey, public, what do you think? But rather give a little bit of background, or these are some options we're considering, or something like that. I think that will give us much better feedback. So that would be helpful, is, if the different task leads have thoughts of like, these are the options we're considering, or something that would be helpful as we do public outreach to get some thoughts and feedback, since we want to start the process sooner rather than later, and not have put together a draft plan and then wait until then to have people give feedback. If we can give some very basic overview to the public and get feedback on that initial thinking, I think that will be beneficial. That's my thought anyway, but I'm happy to, I'll be paying attention and make sure that I share whatever we discuss here with Just Transitions and vice versa.
Jared, is your hand up, or is that artifact? Okay.
It was old. It was old.
I'll step in with Jared's old hand down now. Thank you for that update, you guys, and this is so important. I wanted to just ask, and I feel like I want to be following this conversation more, but I'm glad this is all underway. It sounds great. One of my questions is, is the Just Transition Committee thinking about, or how should we be thinking about, working towards the development of a plan, but then also recognizing there will be accompanying needs for and public process around, designing, like more like refining and designing the policies and the programs even further. so that we have a public engagement process now, we craft recommendations, that's our first public plan, and then there's going to need to be more public engagement around to get more specific. For example, like the Transportation Climate Initiative, you know, that has come up in our transportation task group is like, this is a regional approach, you know, Vermont's been at the table. There is an MOU that sets sort of high level parameters around program design, but then states can go further and sort of, if Vermont joined the TCI program, then we would have agency over, you know, potentially how those revenues were distributed, and they could be distributed more equitably. Like Massachusetts has a concept in place where 70% of those TCI revenues would go directly to marginalized communities. And I feel like if we, I guess my question is, that's an example to say, you know, if we put like a proposal like TCI on the table, it's coming up again in our transportation conversation a lot. We're still going to need to do work, and I don't know if we get to that work before December, to like go further on designing the program and the implementation with the Just Transition Subcommittee and with Vermonters. And I'm just curious how we might be thinking about that, or the Just Transition Subcommittee is thinking about that. Like, this is an ongoing process that we're lifting up in this moment. We're going to do for 30 years, and we're going to have different iterations along the way. So I'm just wanted to ask that as a question.
Committee comments on that, or response from Jane and Peter?
Or to Jane, if the consultant if there's been any guidance from the consultant or thinking about that.
So to your first point, Joey, about sort of like the public engagement process now and the public engagement process around the draft plan, there are clear strategies that they've articulated in their proposal about those sort of like how to engage with the public early on to craft things, and then tools that we'll need to actually have them inform the recommendations and strategies that we put forward in the form of a plan. There has also been language and thought around, or recognition at the very least, I would say, and Kelly hopefully will echo this, at the Just Transitions Committee, that we're setting a seed for robust public engagement and discourse around the work of the Climate Action Plan. And all this we can hope to do is start those conversations and dialogues, have them early and often now, but set the stage for what that process will look like long term, recognizing that it is an iterative process and that there's going to have to be involvement long term around how we interact with the Vermonters around sort of a systemic change that we're hoping to realize through the development of the Climate Action Plan. And so I'll just say that, you know, Just Transitions is just starting to dive into that. And I think next week will be a really substantive conversation around what we can and can't do for this first plan, but how we build the processes to see them into the future. And so, yeah, I'll leave it at that. So yes, there's starting to be conversations, but no discrete recommendations yet, I feel like, on what that will look like.
So I will also chime in on a point made earlier, I think by you, Kelly, that it's really helpful to members of the public to be given useful information about, first of all, the situation we're in and, you know, what the legislature is asking for, but also about the pros and cons of some, at a high level, pros and cons of some different policy approaches, as instead of just asking people flat out, well, what do you think? You know, the experience that I've had in the past, and that I've seen really good studies on this, that, you know, people respond really positively to being given good information and then being asked, what do you think we should do based on this information? And I would like somehow to make sure that we you know, give Vermonters the benefit of good information, and, you know, knowing that people want to know, as well as express opinions. So somehow I think that means that there needs to be a connection between the policy frames that we're developing, you know, on the different committees, and the outreach process that may be happening, so that we don't kind of waste time and waste the time of members of the public, showing up to a meeting that's kind of talking in a vacuum. So, and Jane, you said it nicely a minute ago. I don't mind reinforcing the point. You said early and often, and it's iterative. We want input before we've baked our cakes, as it were, and we also want to give people an idea about what different policies mean when we're asking for their responses to it. I mean, it's a complicated process because there's so many different issue areas. So you kind of have to decide how can we do this in a way that really solicits genuine, thoughtful input from people. And maybe the web page is a good way, a website that's active is a good way to do that, because you're not asking people to show up on Tuesday night at 7 o'clock and discuss housing, transportation, agriculture, and everything else under the sun. I'll stop. I encourage collaboration across the committees as we figure out how to engage public. I see Kelly and then Joey, and then maybe we should stop and move on. All right, it's just Kelly. Kelly?
Just wanted to add one more thing, which is that we have discussed in Just Transitions, making sure that we don't just fall into the trap of doing public engagement as usual, which will probably result in the same usual suspects being engaged. So that's what makes it all the more important, in my view, to make sure that we do have a background provided to people, and really get the thoughts of a wide variety of Vermonters who are all going to be impacted by climate change and all impacted by the decisions we're making here. So that's something also to be considering as we're figuring out how we want to, how this committee wants to help with that direction of the engagement process.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay.
So Rich, maybe if I could quickly sum up, I think what get back to our work within here, I think there's the broader outreach strategies and how we want to engage early enough. But I worry that we are, because of the speed at which we need to act and to develop ideas, that some of the ideas that will be, or some of our sort of narrowing of the list may be baked or more baked than we'd like it to be based on our desire for public input. And so I would encourage, and maybe we need to table this full conversation to the next meeting, but I don't think we're there yet with all of the subcommittees or the task leads, but thinking through whether or not we each are holding some level of sort of idea gathering sessions with the public and what that looks like. Because I do think that that needs to be part of it, so that we don't get way into the weeds on something and realize that we're missing a whole another piece that Vermonters would like us to focus
on. Good point. And maybe we can fold that into the work of the discussion leads, because I know that a significant amount of conversing, has gone on in the past around a number of these ideas, and is going on in parallel in other venues too. So it's not like we're the only folks talking about these topics. I'd like to take a couple of minutes. We have just a few minutes remaining for task leads to share with the rest of the subcommittee what you've been doing, what ideas you're gravitating towards at the moment, and if you want to comment on the outreach that you've done or expect to do, just informally, to gather good thinking from folks. That would be good to mention as well. So I'm looking at my screen and I see Dave Farnsworth is at the top of my screen, so Dave, you go.
Okay, lucky Dave. Thanks, Rich. So really briefly, if I were to articulate what the big ticket items are for buildings, weatherization, low income and otherwise, figuring out carbon benefits associated with shell and other improvements in buildings, really important. The second part of this would be clean fuels and adoption of clean fuels, which when you tease that out a little bit, involves beneficial electrification, change out of appliances associated with that, advanced wood heat, the development of clean heat standard, which would bring delivered fuels into this discussion and account for those emissions. So I'd say those two things, weatherization and clean fuels. As far as the outreach, there's been a fair bit of historic outreach on buildings. I won't go back to RAP's 2008 paper on buildings for the legislature, the 2011 paper. We did one a year and a half ago, and so people are pretty pretty aware of this as a potential source for carbon reductions. There have been informal discussions going on since I've participated in this. EAN has got some interesting discussions going on, and others are engaged in this informally. And what Jane just described, the formal process, I welcome that. That's great. I think when we get things in a little bit more focus, I think you can take things onto the road and say, look, it's not a fully baked cake, but this is what we're thinking. What do you all think? So that's my report.
Thanks, Dave. Any questions or comments on buildings? Transportation?
So pulled together a few conversations with diverse stakeholders and also working with existing arenas of groups who are focused on transportation, like Transportation for Vermonters, which is a diverse coalition of groups, to sort of ground truth some ideas, obviously a work in process, but not a lot has changed since when we gave an overview 2 weeks ago in terms of, we need to, electrify and a lot. We need to move people out of fossil fuel powered vehicles. We need to be far more efficient. We need to, provide options for getting people where they need to go. So I would say a couple different things. There's a recognition that we need to, we need to sort of find or realign existing revenues or find revenues to do this work. Transportation and Climate Initiative certainly has come up quite a bit. Also, just to underscore what you raised very early on in this conversation, which I think is really important, there will be federal funding coming in. There are the ARPA dollars. Probably not a lot of them are going to go to transportation, but if there is an infrastructure bill, if people were listening to what President Biden laid out yesterday, and ideally we will move forward, is a massive investment in a transportation system of the 21st century, and I think that could be very helpful. It could also potentially, through ARPA dollars and other federal funding, help to make investments in our downtowns and our community centers. We've talked about sort of rate design, other potential programs, other revenue raising strategies. So it's a work in process, but so we're looking at how are you realigning or raising the revenues, and how are to support the programs, because we have some very good programs here in the state of Vermont. So to build from. Sorry about that. I see Gina, who's working closely on this, has something to add, so I'd welcome that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we've really been combing through the technology pathways that are in the previous plans and also in EAN's work, and thinking in terms of 2025, 37, and 50, the strategies are going to be very different. And most of our work right now is evaluating the 2025 options based on the criteria that are in the statute. So it's not a lot of rocket science. We look forward to the consultants bringing us new ideas, but a lot of the strategies are around electrification, as Joey said, for the immediate future. Long term, we can start talking about VMT reductions, but electrification in the small duty and somewhat in heavy duty sectors or fleets are where we're headed.
Thanks, Joey and Gina.
I would just invite anyone, if there are folks that you think, I mean, I'm looking forward to the public engagement process and the thinking, the just transitions, but certainly open to, engaging others in this conversation because we need a lot of different partners and as thought partners.
What about rural transit, creative rural transit solutions, even in the short term?
Yep,
I mean, we're going to have everything on the table, but it's the immediate bang for the buck right now, and this is what the consultants will deliver to us, appears to be in terms of emissions reductions. It's electrification. It's very clear that will work. It's a technology that we have right now, and there is some funding for it. We're going to need a whole lot more. That's not off the, that's got to be part of the solution, absolutely. But to make meaningful change in that by 2025, I believe is going to be challenging. It's not that we don't keep our nose to the grindstone.
All right, thanks. Power sector, Ed or Liz?
Sure, I think Ed had another meeting, so I can do a partial job at least representing where we are and what's occurred. And I just want to say, Gina, it's a pleasure to have you on this subcommittee because that's sort of like, I don't know, bracing honesty that you just had there. Like, yep, we can do that too. But if we're going to get progress, let's stick with the, what we know makes progress right now is so important. And it transitions well to electricity. We have not changed our focus from what you heard 2 weeks ago with the electricity sector, given where it is already on carbon reductions being an enabler for fuel switching, essentially, in the two sectors that we've just heard from, making sure that we do what we can to keep electricity and its source cost effective and low carbon so that we really do enable that transition. We have, because of the comprehensive energy plan work that's really working at the same time as this subcommittee's work, a lot of coordination to do. And so that's where we have been focusing our efforts, just understanding where the CEP work is and how that will dovetail with this, because when it comes to policies to achieve further carbon reductions in the electricity sector, it's the ones that Ed mentioned on the call a few weeks ago, primarily looking at the renewable energy standard that's in place here and understanding what the design choices would be to move that renewable energy standard toward 100% from where it is now at 75%, recognizing that even with no action, just given where the utilities are and what policies are already in place and what announcements have already been made, the sector may be very close to that 100% carbon free by around the 2030 time period, which of course is key to enabling the work that we're all talking about. That RES discussion, my understanding is, and if Ed were on the phone, he could amplify this, will be a part of the comprehensive energy plan deep dive that they're doing. So making sure that we align with how that work is happening will be important. And then in terms of other policies that can help enable some of the work that all of you have focused on, load management, looking at ways to encourage both direct control and rate design that supports it, I think is key and is where we have focused. There will be some need for further outreach, especially to the other committees here. And I'm interested in hearing more, and I've put on the calendar next Wednesday, I think it was Wednesday's meeting with Just Transitions, hearing more how we can get further input from the public at large when it comes to the electricity sector. Mindful, though, that it needs to be with the focus of this work, which is carbon reduction, because, of course, there are many other policies and kind of thoughts behind the electricity sector that wouldn't necessarily put carbon up front. So I don't have an update on what I would call informal outreach beyond what we've talked about before and the work that we're doing to coordinate with the CEP. And I guess I should put Colin on that list. We had talked already about reaching out to make sure that Colin's GHG inventory work, which the Department of Public Service understands very well, is also coordinated with the kind of larger subgroup work that we're doing here. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Liz. Would you be looking at transmission upgrades as something that would be on the list to recommend?
Yeah, no, I think we heard it all again 2 weeks ago, but the list, just to finish it, is the RES policy work that the CEP will be looking at, load management through direct control and rate design, and the third area was grid resiliency, including siting and locational work on the distribution side, as well as coordinating on the bulk electricity side. Much of that work is happening right now. There are already systems and, programs in place to ensure that it happens. So in terms of supporting additional investments, accessing additional funds should they become available, those are certainly things that we would expect this subcommittee to support and include. But it doesn't, unlike some other sectors, it doesn't appear that there's a whole new framework that's needed, because there are policies and programs in place to support that. And yes, grid resiliency is a big part of that. And of course, there's cross-cutting work there with the Rural Resiliency Committee, because one of the things that I recall Ed put on the list, and he and I have talked about, is further support for what we at GMP are calling resiliency zones, looking at a community level at how you can find resources in a community that combine communications, electricity infrastructure, local generation, and perhaps storage, so that communities can recover more quickly in the event of natural disasters, for example, or other reasons why they could be cut off. So I think that all fits with that last piece that you mentioned in terms of infrastructure, and yes, will be a part of what we are focused on.
Thanks very much. Gina, I see your hand is still up. Is that an artifact?
Yes.
Okay. Peter.
Great, thanks, Rich. So we are, so I think one of the things that we've been waiting on that we should have resolution on, I understand at the steering committee meeting that happens after this, is for who's in charge of the ag emissions reductions, kind of a critical piece. Either way, it'll involve a joint discussion with lots of the stakeholders in the agricultural space around where we get those emissions reductions. We have been thinking about just sort of looking at the emissions inventory breakdown and trying to understand where those things come from. For example, one of the major sources is the Global Foundry's use of ozone depleting substances, substitute piece for in their chip fab manufacture, and they have been making progress, and we want to understand what that looks like as that'll affect the sort of reference case and what needs to be done, because it's the one area where there is a major single source of activity. And so understanding that piece, understanding what the impact of our rules that phase down the use of HFCs in various products and uses, and what that will mean for our emissions overall is an important piece. So we're still in the data gathering stage. I would probably, from my perspective, we're probably going to need to have multiple conversations with the public and with stakeholders, because of, it's not just sort of power sector folks or folks who work in the building space generally. We would need to talk to the ag community. We would need to talk to the sort of waste community, all of those different groups together. So we're still sort of formulating our plan, I guess.
All right. Any questions from the committee members on any of what you just heard? Suggestions for folks to focus on different issues? All right. It sounds I'm gathering this a sort of, I'd say, broad support for the priorities that each of you has identified. So go forth and continue to do good until we meet again on that subject. Anything further among the committee members before we turn to public comments? All right, I think we are ready for public comments, and I noticed Rob Lamert you have been patiently attending and ready to speak for quite a while. Please go ahead. Jane, can you make that possible?
I'll be brief, but I'd like to cover a few topics quickly, just introduce them. First, one thing that I think would be extremely valuable would be a full LCA on the life cycle of wastewater treatment, including the transportation and disposition of sewage sludge and digestate. Since these, we're hauling a lot of water for openers. Most of this stuff is 80% water, and it can go 100 miles in one direction to landfill. It does immense wear on our roads and bridges and has all sorts of supplemental damage. But that's one area that I'd really like to know how bad it is, because there are ways to remediate it, which we can talk about at another time. Second, I wanted to bring to your attention that I've submitted 2 postings to the public comments page. They're awaiting posting. One of them is a paper on the use of biochar in animal feeding. There's significant benefit in methane reductions because of biochar, but it makes the animals healthier and they love it. It's cheap and there's no reason why we shouldn't be doing it. So there's that. The second one is a pretty extensive overview of an industrial biochar operation and what's involved in constructing and operating it and what it does. And for anyone who is not familiar with the topic, I've highlighted it so that you don't have to read the entire thing. But it does handle some of the very significant points that I wanted to make sure you knew about that. Third, I wanted to make sure that the point was understood that we can have the benefits of carbon sequestration using biocarbon, but it's largely a private enterprise. Nobody's asking for the state of Vermont to start making biochar. What we need is a market. We have in our surrounding states markets that have developed around it. I see that there is a very large plant going into an abandoned paper mill in Maine right now. What we need is markets. And to that point, the value of carbon sequestered permanently that has a separate utility, but just the simple act of removing the carbon has an international market value of over $60 a ton. Now, to that point, NRCS, the Natural Resources Conservation Board, published a soil conservation standard last fall, Soil Standard 808, and has a program which Marshall Webb at Shelburne Farms has applied for. We will be applying probably somewhere in the order of 40 tons of biochar at Shelburne Farms. That biochar will be inoculated using his manure lagoons because biochar absorbs nitrogen very well. We'll be eliminating the smell from the manure lagoons, and once the biochar is saturated, it will go on to the fields. Now, Marshall is responsible as a carbon coordinator at Shelburne Farms and has a specific mission to reduce their emissions to zero. And he's he's gone through phases 1, 2, and 3 of the analysis, and we're looking for ways to reduce his carbon footprint. And this gives him an opportunity probably to sequester about 120 tons of CO2 on the fields. But the question remains, can he claim that? Because he didn't actually make it. He bought it from Quebec because we have no capacity in Vermont. And the question of ownership flows over to what would happen in Vermont if private industry developed these plants and then sold the carbon removal certificates out of state. And it would be very similar to what we've got with RECs. You need to keep that in mind, that these are valuable things, much more valuable than RECs. Oh, for crying out loud, probably my auto warranty. All right. Anyway, that's my comment, and I look forward to additional conversations in the future.
Rob, thank you. And don't we all get those auto warranty calls? It's on 11.
Yes. Hello. This is Donna Laban. And I wasn't going to comment, but I did, when you were going through the weatherization measures, consistently, there's sort of a lack of discussion about new construction. And since the folks from Building Green couldn't make it onto the committee, I just wanted to put together a paper to be endorsed by the American Institute of Architects of Vermont that deals with a couple of issues that we want to make sure get addressed by the Climate Council. A very easy and cost-effective one, it may not be politically easy, but it's actually the easiest one out there, is to actually create an effective enforcement mechanism for the energy code. Right now, according to Barry Murphy at the Department of Public Service, only about 50% of the homes built in Vermont right now, maybe a little more than 50%, actually meet the newest energy standards. So there's a lack of enforcement other than by the legal system really isn't working. And also electrification is not dealt with in energy codes, nor is material carbon sequestration. And all of those things, believe it or not, are things that architects have a lot of control over. And, you know, we're an educated bunch of people who write specifications and have, you know, major input into not just energy codes, but all these other issues that I've addressed. So I would like to know exactly who can we send this position paper to make sure that it gets actually to the committee members. I think AIA did send through the Natural Resources Department an earlier position paper that was more general, but I'm not actually sure that people got to see that. So we want to make sure that we're more direct in sending our recommendations, particularly since next week or next meeting you're going to be talking in more detail about measures. We want to make sure that these do not continue to be missed.
Thank you. Jane, do you have a recommendation for that? I mean, I'm happy to accept it and circulate it to the committee, but it's something I would think you would normally do.
Yeah, I mean, there is a public input form now on the website. And so the intent is for, and which allows for documents to be uploaded there, including position papers. So the intent is to funnel the large majority of those through the public input form process. But the original paper that you referred to was circulated to the council, to the full council. I don't recall at the moment if it also went to all the subcommittee members also, but it went to the full council. So you can put it up there. That's the best way. And maybe in your comments or notes, you can comment or allude like particular interest to the cross-sector mitigation, which you'll see there is a drop down on the public input form to sort of highlight who information is most pertinent for, the full council, which subcommittee, et cetera, et cetera. So you please just note cross sector in particular for that one.
Okay.
And thanks for highlighting it here. I'm sure the folks who are involved in the buildings discussion will want to take a look.
Okay. Thank you.
Steve Crowley.
Hi, thanks very much. And thanks for all of your work on this monumental task that you've all taken on. I want to make a few quick points. I'd be happy to converse about any of them at greater length, but I'll just try to highlight a few things that I've heard you talking about today. Mostly this relates to the question of the greenhouse gas inventory and how that plays into this whole process. The first thing, I guess I appreciate that Chairman Cowart mentioned that the law pretty clearly directs that you take account of that we reduce out-of-state impacts from energy, where Vermont use has energy impacts out of state. We follow that pipeline, and it's pretty clear. A few quick things to say about that. One, this is not the same as chaotic butterfly flapping its wings in China. It's not that kind of causality. It's really more like what we saw with COVID in the last year, where when we parked our cars, and everybody else did, all the way back up the pipeline, it went back to production shut down, and refineries trimmed down. So there's a clear causal connection between what we do here and right back up the pipeline. And I think that's what the law calls for. I don't think that it is a conflict to have two different inventory systems. We have two different requirements. We have one requirement that involves reporting to the EPA, et cetera, and coordinating with other states, and really important to avoid double counting there. But where we're trying to assess what our responsibility as human beings is in the state of Vermont for taking care of the planet, we really should be looking up the pipeline. So those are two. I don't see them in conflict unless somebody tries to make them the same. Then they create that conflict. But they're really parallel systems that don't need to connect. Same data inputs, but just a different reporting form. The third point about that is that, in my view, if you do that, obviously you crank up the numbers, the raw numbers of that are implicated in our activities, the numbers of in terms of emissions. But it doesn't change the scale of the challenge, right? It's still, as you pointed out, the reductions are bigger too. So the starting point is higher, but then when you take a car off the road, it has a bigger impact than with the previous, with the old system. It does have the potential for shifting priorities and what works, what's important to incorporate. A second point I'd like to make is that it's with regard to electricity accounting particularly, a couple of things. It's not clear that RECs count in our system under the Global Warming Solutions Act. There's no mention of RECs, and that's a considerable portion of our electricity. Another part of our electricity accounting involves carbon emissions from biomass, from large hydro, from fugitive methane. All of those are directly implicated in our use of electricity, but we don't account for those at all right now. So once you do that, once you correct that part of the system, all of a sudden we actually have a big need to add zero carbon electricity to our mix. And I think that's a missed opportunity here. We really should be building out our renewable energy sector to do that. And whether it's community solar or other solutions, when I see that piece, when I see that as a missing piece of the puzzle, I'm very concerned. My final couple of related points. One, I'm not sure who does this in your teams here, but I think it's really important to develop a system for looking at offsets, alternative reductions, excuse me, that's called for in the law. It's complicated, but I don't see where that fits into your work. And I think that somebody should figure out, where do you handle those offsets? Who's going to handle that? Who's going to design the system? I suspect that it would be a good idea to get your consultant through your RFP to look at that. What are the options? And provide, how some other jurisdictions handle that. And related to that is a very important question about additionality. It's a complicated question. It's a critical question because, you know, we have a certain status quo with our global climate, and we're part of that. And our Global Warming Solutions Act commits us to being part of the solution. And we can only do that by figuring out what the status quo is and then moving forward from there, whether it's in terms of additional sequestration or additional reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. Complicated. I won't take it further than that. Happy to talk more, but thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Excellent comments. Anybody else, any other member of the public like to address the committee? Well, we're at our ending time.
A number of folks have to drop already.
Yeah, I see. George, can you be very brief? We're at our ending.
Sure. Just want to follow up with Steve's remarks. I'm pleased to see that there was an active discussion of the various approaches to doing greenhouse gas accounting. I echo Steve's concern that the law is pretty clear that there should be out-of-state emissions tracked through the whole life cycle of the various related energy consumption fuels we have. And it's my contention that there's enough reliable data to start that process in this current year. I'm concerned with Mr. Walk's statement that suggested that the life cycle analysis type of inventory would not make it into this year's work program or be completed in time for the climate action plan as part of it. So I would recommend that you consider a life cycle analysis of the various major fuels that are used in Vermont today on a provisional basis. And obviously you'll do a refinement for future versions. An initial version would obviously be refined as we discover things like what are the upstream emissions for our fossil gas use, what is the upstream emissions of methane and carbon dioxide of hydroelectric that we use. But you know, basically, there's a lot of parameters that are going to have some fuzziness initially, but can be refined over time. But that's no barrier to actually fulfilling the intent of the law.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
And yeah. We are at the end of time, and I think we're ready to adjourn. Is there anything further from a member of the committee? All right, then.
Thank you, everybody.
We're adjourned, and thanks to everybody, including the public comments. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.